The air in the L'Enfant Plaza metro station was January cold, the kind that seeped through coats and made people walk a little faster, shoulders hunched. It was just past 7:40 in the morning, on a Tuesday, the heart of rush hour. A river of people in dark coats and polished shoes flowed from the escalators and train platforms, a steady, rhythmic current of purpose. Briefcases swung, earbuds were tucked in, eyes were fixed on the middle distance or the black screens of early model phones. The sound was a low symphony of its own, the distant roar of trains, the click of heels on hard floor, the rustle of newspapers, and the murmur of 1,000 separate conversations all blending into a single note of white noise dot at one of the station's main entrances. Near a set of trash cans, a man in his late 30s found a bare patch of floor. He wasn't remarkable to look at. He wore a long-sleeved T-shirt under a dark sweater, jeans, and a Washington Nationals baseball cap pulled low over his brow. He could have been anyone, a contractor, a grad student, a guy who worked in IT. He had the slightly weary look of someone who'd been up early. He laid down a small square of carpet, the kind you might find in a dorm room, and opened a simple, worn violin case. From the case, he lifted a violin. To the untrained eye, it was just another violin, honey-colored and graceful. But it was an instrument that had survived centuries, crafted by the hands of Antonio Stradivari himself, worth more than most houses. The man tightened the bow, applied a little rosin, and gave a few quiet, experimental strokes. The notes that came out were warm and complex. But the sound was swallowed instantly by the cavernous space. He took a breath, closed his eyes for a second, and then began to play. The piece was Johann Sebastian Bach's Chaconne in D minor, a monument of music written for solo violin. It is a piece that contains multitudes' profound grief, unwavering resilience, and a kind of spiritual searching. It is considered one of the most difficult and emotionally draining pieces ever composed for the instrument. In a concert hall, its opening notes command a silence so deep you can hear your own heartbeat out here, the first clear. Mournful phrases spilled into the air and were immediately run over by the 7:48 train, pulling into the station. The musician's fingers flew over the fingerboard with a fluid, unconscious mastery. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm of the music, his expression one of deep concentration. He was not just playing notes. He was inside the music, feeling every shift from darkness to a fragile, questioning light. The people kept coming. A woman in a tan trench coat walked directly in front of him, her phone pressed to her ear. "I'm in the station. I'll be there in 10, she said, her voice cutting through the batch. She didn't glance down. A young man in a crisp suit, carrying a leather satchel, slowed for half a step. His head turned minutely, not toward the musician, but as if trying to identify a faint, bothersome sound. He adjusted his satchel strap and sped up, his mind already in his first meeting. The first minute passed. Then, too, the chaconne unfolded, building in complexity. The musician's bow sawed passionately across the strings during the fierce, dramatic sections, then softened to a whisper for passages of unbearable tenderness. He was giving it everything, the same energy and precision he would give to a sold-out crowd at Carnegie Hall, got over by the wall. A metro station cleaner paused, leaning on his push-broom. He listened for a full 30 seconds, a faint smile on his face. He nodded in time, then seemed to remember his supervisor and went back to sweeping, though he kept his movements slow, close by. 3 minutes in, a middle-aged commuter, a man with a kind face and a government ID badge dangling from his lanyard, broke from the strain. He stopped at the edge of the little carpet, looked directly at the violinist, and listened. He stood still for 5 seconds, 10. He seemed to be truly hearing it. Then, as if an internal alarm went off, he jerked his wrist up to check his watch. A look of mild panic flashed across his features. He dug into his pocket, pulled out a $1 bill, tossed it carefully into the open violin case, and power walked away, disappearing into the crowd. It was an act of charity, not connection. The musician saw the dollar land. A barely perceptible flicker in his expression, not disappointment, but a deepening of his focus. He was settling into the reality of the experiment. This was the agreement. Play for 45 minutes as if it were a real performance. See what happens. Don't make eye contact to solicit attention. Just be the man with the violin. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, being dragged by her mother's hand, twisted her whole body to look back at him. Her eyes were wide with wonder at the beautiful sound. Her mother, talking rapidly into her phone, gave her hand a firm, impatient tug. "Come on," the mother said, and the girl was spun around, her view of the musician gone. The natural curiosity of a child pulled back into the current dot. The music continued. It was now a battle, though a silent, polite one. The sublime versus the schedule. The eternal beauty of Batch's architecture against the immediate, pressing need to catch the blue line train. And the schedule was winning, effortlessly. A group of tourists with maps wandered through, looking confused. The sound of the violin registered for a moment, and one of them pointed vaguely in the direction. But they were looking for a Smithsonian exit, not a concert. They shuffled past Dot. The musician transitioned seamlessly into another piece, Franz Schubert's Ave Maria. The melody was more recognizable, a soaring, lyrical line that seemed to plead for attention. It floated up toward the high, vaulted ceiling of the station. This time, a woman in a bright red scarf slowed. She stopped. She actually turned and faced him. For a beautiful, suspended moment, it seemed the experiment had its first real subject. She listened, her head tilted. The violinist felt it, that subtle energy of an audience member engaging. He played a phrase directly to her, putting a little extra grace into the notes. Then, from her coat pocket, her phone buzzed violently. She jumped, fumbled for it, looked at the screen, and put it to her ear. "Hello?" "Yeah, I'm right here," she said, turning her back on him and walking away, her free hand gesturing as she talked. The floor of the violin case held a handful of dollars and some loose change. A few people had dropped money without breaking stride, a transaction completed without any human exchange. One man even threw a bill as he jogged by, as if tossing a coin into a fountain for luck. The clock ticked past the 8 o'clock hour. The rush was at its peak. The river of people seemed endless, a blur of focused faces. The man in the baseball cap played on. His fingers were warm now, the music flowing from him as naturally as breath. He watched the shoes go by, polished loafers, scuffed trainers, sharp boots, practical pumps. A sea of shoes, moving in a relentless, uniform direction. No one's feet stopped. He wondered, briefly, if there was something wrong with the sound. Was the station eating it? Was he playing poorly? He listened to his own playing with a critical ear. No, the technique was solid. The tone was pure. It was just irrelevant. He was part of the environment, a human fixture, like the trash cans or the newspaper stand. He was the man with the violin, a piece of street furniture that occasionally made a pleasant, if ignorable, sound. He caught a snippet of conversation from 2 men walking past. So the report has to be on his desk by 10, or the whole thing. The music, his life's work, his passion, was just background noise to their world. It was a profoundly strange feeling. In any other context, these same people would be paying a fortune to hear him. They would dress up, sit in silence, and give him a standing ovation. Here, he was less noticeable than the ads on the wall. He finished the Ave Maria and moved into a technically dazzling piece by Manuel Ponce. His fingers danced, the notes pirouetting in the dusty, cold air. It was a performance of fire and precision. A performance that, in another life, would have brought down the house. Not a single pair of shoes stopped. Not a single head turned. The man in the cap played on, a solitary island of sound in the vast, indifferent sea of the morning commute. The first part of the experiment was over. The social test was running its course. And so far, the results were clear and quietly heartbreaking. The world, in its hurry, had no time for a master. It had trains to catch. The river of people never seemed to slow. Just as one stream emptied onto a train platform, another would spill from the escalators, fresh and urgent. The man with the violin had become part of the station's machinery, a fixed point around which the human current divided and flowed. The cold from the floor was seeping through the thin carpet now, into his shoes, but his hands were warm, almost hot. With the work of playing, he switched to a brighter, faster piece, a showy number by the early 20th century composer Henryk Wieniawski. It was full of leaps and double stops and flying staccato notes, the kind of piece designed to make an audience gasp and then burst into applause. Here it sounded frantic, like a bird trapped in a large tiled cage, trying to get someone's attention. A man in a very expensive-looking gray overcoat, talking in a loud, important voice on a bulky cell phone, came and stood barely 4 feet from the violinist. He was facing away, completely blocking the path of a few commuters who had to sidestep around him with annoyed looks. "No, listen," the man in the coat boomed into his phone. "The numbers on the third quarter are non-negotiable. You tell him that." His voice drowned out the delicate, fluttering passage the violinist was playing. He stood there, an immovable monument to his own conversation, for a full 2 minutes. He never once looked at the source of the music he was shouting over. He ended his call, snapped his phone shut, and marched off, leaving a temporary pocket of quiet that felt almost shocking. The violinist watched him go, a strange, quiet thought forming. This man was a force of nature. The music wasn't even an obstacle for him. It simply didn't exist. It was like playing for a wall. The thought wasn't angry. It was more like a scientist observing a fascinating behavior. He adjusted his stance a little and dove into the next section. Over by the second trash can, a mother was struggling. She had a toddler on her hip, a heavy-looking diaper bag sliding off her shoulder, and she was trying to wrangle a slightly older child who was fascinated by a gum wrapper on the floor. The toddler on her hip was staring, mesmerized, at the dancing bow of the violinist. His little eyes followed it back and forth, back and forth. The mother, her face tight with stress and lack of sleep, bounced the child absently. She was humming a little, just a tuneless but her humming was unconsciously matching the rhythm of the violin. For a moment, her body and the music were connected. She was listening, but not with her ears. She was listening with her tired bones. Then the older child made a run for it, and she lunged, the spell broken. "I said stop," she hissed, her voice frayed. A family disappeared into the crowd, the toddler still looking back over her shoulder, until he was out of sight. The money in the case was growing, but slowly, and in a way that felt more like litter and appreciation. A few more people performed the walk-by toss. It had a specific rhythm, a slight slowdown, a hand dipping into a pocket or purse, a flick of the wrist, and then an immediate resumption of speed, eyes already fixed ahead on the escalator or the train indicator. It was a transaction completely stripped of human contact. No smile, no nod, certainly no eye contact. The coin or bill would land, sometimes with a soft thud on the carpet, sometimes with a clink on the others. One woman, holding a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other, somehow managed to fish out a $5 bill with her pinky finger and drop it in without spilling a drop or breaking stride. It was a feat of commuter dexterity, Then came the man who hated it. He was an older guy, in a maintenance uniform for the transit authority. He had a sour expression, a permanent squint. He'd been mopping the same patch of floor for 10 minutes, clearly using the work as an excuse to people watch. The music seemed to get under his skin. Every time the violin would hit a particularly high, sweet note, the man would shake his head slightly or scrunch his shoulders. Finally, he leaned on his mop handle and called out, not directly to the violinist, but to the air. "A little loud, ain't it?" He muttered. The violinist, following the rules of the experiment, didn't engage. He just kept playing, softening the next few phrases instinctively. But the maintenance man wasn't done. He needed someone to agree with him. He caught the eye of a passing office worker. "They just let anybody set up shop here," he said, jerking his thumb. The office worker, a young man with headphones already in his ears, just gave a confused, tight-lipped smile and hurried on. Frustrated, the maintenance man went back to his mopping, pushing the wet string mop aggressively over the tiles in time with the music. As if trying to wipe the sound away, it was one of the few reactions that wasn't indifference. It was active, mild annoyance. The violinist found it perversely refreshing. At least it was something. He played a series of low, resonant notes, right in the range of the mop's squeak, as if answering him in a language the man couldn't understand. The peak rush hour was starting to fade. The crowds were still steady, but they were no longer a solid, unbroken wall. You could see gaps now, little moments of empty space. In one of these gaps, something small happened. A delivery man, carrying a stack of cardboard boxes tied with twine, was cutting through the station. He was a big man, with strong, thick hands that were red from the cold. He was clearly in a hurry, his boots thumping on the floor. But as he passed the violinist, he slowed. He didn't stop, but he turned his head and looked, really looked, for the entire 3 seconds it took him to walk past. His face was unreadable, a flat surface, but his eyes were locked on the flying fingers. On the bow there was almost a blur. It was the look of one craftsman recognizing another at a level too deep for words. He saw the work in it. He didn't smile. He didn't throw money. He just took it in, gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod not to the violinist, but to the skill itself, and then he was gone. His heavy footsteps fading, that nod, tiny as it was, felt like the first real piece of communication the violinist had received all morning. It was fuel. He launched into the next piece with renewed energy. But the station wasn't done showing him his place. A group of school kids on a field trip, maybe 10 or 11 years old, came streaming through, shepherded by tired-looking teachers. They were loud and full of energy. One boy, bouncing on the balls of his feet, pointed at the violinist. "Look, a guy," he yelled. A few of his friends looked. One girl said, "My sister plays the violin." But they didn't stop. They were pushed along by the flow of their group. The boy who had pointed reached into his jeans pocket and with a mischievous grin threw a single penny. It missed the case entirely and pinged off the wall behind. He laughed, and his friends laughed with him. The teacher, bringing up the rear, sighed. "Just keep moving, everyone." The violinist was, for them, a curiosity, a minor spectacle on par with a funny-shaped cloud or a street performer who could juggle. The penny wasn't an insult. It was just a kid's impulse, a token tossed at something momentarily interesting. The sun had risen higher outside, and a thin, weak beam of light found its way down from a high window, cutting through the dusty air of the station. It landed on the violinist's feet, warming the toes of his shoes. He was nearing the halfway point of his allotted time. His shoulder was beginning to ache from holding the violin up. His mind was doing a strange dance. Part of it was fully immersed in the music, navigating the complex map of the compositions. Another part was a detached observer, watching this bizarre social theater play out around him. He saw a woman walk past while expertly applying lipstick, using her reflection in the glass of a closed newsstand. She was perfectly in time with the music's rhythm. He saw an old man, moving slowly with a cane, pause for a much-needed rest on a bench. The man closed his eyes, and for a beautiful moment, it seemed he was listening, soaking it in. But then a small snore escaped him. He was just tired, using the music as a lullaby. The case held about $26 and some cents. Mostly ones. A 5 from the coffee lady. The penny from the boy. It was a strange collection, a monetary diary of the morning's non-interactions. The violinist glanced at it during a brief rest between pieces. He thought about the concert he'd given in Austin just 3 days earlier. The cheapest ticket had been $100. People had stood and cheered until their hands were sore. Here. He was worth a handful of loose change and a few annoyed glances. He took a slow breath, reset his focus, and placed the bow back on the strings. The show, for whatever it was worth, had to go on. The second act was over, and the pattern was set. He was part of the scenery, and the people were just passing through. But he kept playing, because that's what he was there to do. The clock on the station wall ticked past 8:30. The real crush of rush hour was over. The people coming through now were stragglers, late starters, and those with less rigid schedules. The flow was thinner, more like a wide stream than a raging river. The violinist felt the shift in his body. The initial adrenaline of the strange experiment had worn off, replaced by a deep, grinding fatigue. His left shoulder burned with a steady ache from holding the violin aloft. The fingertips on his left hand were tender, the strings having pressed tiny, deep grooves into the skin. He was playing a piece by Massenet, Meditation, from the opera Thai. It was a different kind of music from the fiery showpieces he'd played earlier. This was a slow, soaring, heartbreakingly beautiful melody. It was a prayer, a sigh, a longing look out a window at something you could never quite reach. It filled the space in a new way, not fighting the station's noise, but floating above it. A ribbon of silver sadness weaving through the rumble. He played with his eyes mostly closed now, conserving his energy, pouring what was left of his focus into the sound. This was the point in any performance where he would be feeling the audience's energy, a silent exchange that would lift him up and carry him through. Here, there was nothing, just the hollow feeling of playing into a void. It was deeply lonely. He was starting to feel invisible, not just as Joshua Bell the star, but as a human being. He was becoming a machine that made sound, a slightly inconvenient piece of station art. And then something changed. He felt it before he saw it. A shift in the air, a stopping of motion in his peripheral vision. He opened his eyes, just a sliver, while continuing to play. A woman had stopped, not just slowed down or paused to find a Metro card. She had stopped. She was leaning her back against the cold, tiled wall about 15 feet away, her arms folded loosely across her middle. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't scanning for her train. Her eyes were closed. She was simply listening. The violinist's fingers, moving on pure muscle memory, faltered for a nanosecond. It was so unexpected, this complete stillness. He recovered instantly, leaning into the next phrase, playing it directly to her. It was an unconscious thing, the instinct of a performer who finally has a listener. The woman was in her late 40s, maybe early 50s. She had a kind, ordinary face, the sort you might see in a grocery store or a library. She wore a plain, serviceable coat and comfortable shoes. She worked in a federal office building a few blocks away, in a job that involved a lot of paperwork and quiet diligence. Her days were made of routines. This morning, she was a few minutes later than usual. A small gift of time, because the bus had been quicker than expected. When she'd first walked into the station, the music had registered as it did for everyone else. A pleasant bit of background noise. She'd taken a few steps past him, heading for her usual entrance. But then the melody of the meditation had hooked something deep inside her chest. It wasn't a memory, exactly. It was a feeling from a long time ago, from a life that seemed to belong to someone else. She had played the violin as a girl. Not seriously, not like this. She'd taken lessons in a dusty room above a hardware store from an old man who smelled of pipe tobacco and resin. She'd been okay, but she'd lacked the passion, or maybe the courage, to really pursue it. The violin had gone into its case one summer after high school, and had never really come out again. Life had happened: college, a job, caring for aging parents, the quiet settling of years. But her ear had been trained, just a little. And that little bit of training was enough. As she stood there, leaning against the wall with her eyes closed, she wasn't just hearing pretty music. She was hearing the impossible. The purity of the tone, the absolutely seamless shifts from one note to the next, the control that made the difficult sound effortless. This wasn't a good street musician. This was something else entirely. This was a master. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Not at the hat, or the clothes, or the open case with its pathetic scatter of money. She looked at his hands. She watched the fluid, almost magical dance of his left hand on the fingerboard, the precise, graceful arc of his bowing arm. It was hypnotic. The noise of the station, the trains, the announcements, the footsteps, all of it faded into a distant hum. For her, a small, silent room had been built around her and this musician. The tiled walls of the metro station became the walls of a grand hall. The stale, dusty air became the charged atmosphere of a live performance. She understood the gift being offered, even if she didn't understand why it was here. And she knew, instinctively, that the only way to accept such a gift was with her full, undivided attention. So she gave it. She stood rooted to the spot, her grocery list for later forgotten in her pocket, her mild concerns about the day's work dissolving. A profound sense of peace settled over her. It was a peace mixed with a sharp, sweet ache, the ache of beauty recognized, and the faint, ghostly echo of the girl she'd once been, who had held a much cheaper version of this instrument under her. Own Chin Dot, the violinist, played the entire meditation for her. He put every ounce of the loneliness and longing of the last 40 minutes into it. It was a conversation. He would play a phrase full of sorrow, and he could see in the slight softening of her face that she received it. He would play a passage of fragile hope, and she would give the smallest, almost invisible nod. She was his mirror. She was his audience. When the final shimmering note faded, there was a moment of perfect silence between them, even as the world clattered on. He lowered his bow. His eyes met hers. For the first time that morning, he smiled. It was a small, tired, but genuine smile of gratitude. The woman, startled out of her reverie, smiled back. It was a warm, crinkling at the eyes smile. She didn't approach. She didn't throw money. That would have felt wrong, like tipping a king. Instead, she did something else. She brought her hands together in front of her chest and clapped. Just 3 times. Softly, almost privately. Clap, clap, clap. It was the only applause he would receive all morning. It wasn't the roaring ovation of thousands. It was better. It was real. Then the spell broke. The woman glanced at the clock on the wall. The practical world rushed back in. She had to go. She pushed herself away from the wall, gave him one last, long look that said, "Thank you, I saw you," and then she turned and walked towards the escalator, her steps slower and more thoughtful than when she had entered. The violinist watched her go, until she was completely swallowed by the crowd. The strange, hollow feeling in his chest was gone. It had been filled, not by a crowd's adoration, but by one person's deep, true listening. That was enough. It had to be enough. He took a long drink from a water bottle he had tucked behind his case. His shoulders still ached, but it didn't matter as much now. He had one more piece to play, his finale. He set the violin back under his chin. The station, which had felt so hostile and indifferent before, now felt just like a place. A place where one person, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, had chosen to hear the music. He began to play his last selection. For the first time all morning, he wasn't playing for an experiment, or for the passing crowd, or out of a sense of professional duty. He was playing for the woman who had stopped, and for the echo of her applause, which still hung in the air around him, quieter than the trains, but louder than anything else he'd heard all day. The last piece was a famous romantic work by Manuel Ponce, Estrellita, or Little Star. It was a piece the violinist had played as an encore for cheering crowds all over the world. He played it now with a new kind of energy. The weariness was still there in his muscles, but the core of him felt alive again. He played it for the empty space against the wall where the woman had stood. He played it with a gentle lyrical sweetness, as if telling a secret to a friend. As the final high note hung in the air and slowly dissolved, he lowered his bow and his violin. The experiment was over. 43 minutes had passed. The silence that followed was not the dramatic silence of a concert hall, but the ordinary, bustling silence of a train station where one particular sound had stopped. He stood there for a moment, just breathing, feeling the strange ache in his shoulder and the deeper, more complicated feeling in his heart. Then, like any street performer would, he began the process of packing up. He carefully loosened the bow, wiped the violin's neck with a soft cloth from his case, and nestled the instrument back into its molded bed. It was a ritual he'd performed 10,000 times, but never in quite these circumstances. A few late commuters trickled by. One man, seeing the case being closed, hurried over. "Oh, are you done?" "Here," he said, tossing a crumpled dollar bill into the case just before the lid closed. He gave a quick, self-satisfied nod and walked off, perhaps feeling he'd caught the show just in time. The violinist knelt on the thin carpet. He gathered the money, smoothing out the bills. There were ones, a few fives, a surprising number of coins. He counted it carefully. $32.17. He put it in his pocket, the physical weight of it feeling absurdly light. He folded the carpet, tucked it under his arm, picked up the case, and stood. He was just a man with a violin case again, utterly anonymous. He walked out of the station the same way he had walked in, just another person in the crowd. The morning sun was brighter now, glaring off the windows of the office buildings. The city was fully awake, roaring with its ordinary business. He blended into the flow of pedestrians and disappeared. For the commuters who had passed through L'Enfant Plaza that morning, the rest of the day unfolded as usual. Meetings were attended, reports were filed, coffee was drunk. The man with the violin was a fleeting, forgotten impression, if he was remembered at all. For the woman who had stopped, the day felt subtly different. A small, warm coal of private wonder glowed quietly inside her. The memory of the music played in her head during quiet moments at her desk. She told a colleague at lunch, "You'll never believe the violinist in the metro this morning. He was astonishing." Her colleague had smiled vaguely and changed the subject to a deadline. So she kept the experience to herself, a perfect solitary jewel. 3 days later, on a Monday, everything changed. The newspaper came out. The story was on the front page of the style section, with a large photograph of the very same violinist, but not as he looked that morning. This was a photo of him in a concert hall, in a tailored suit, holding his violin with the easy grace of a superstar. The headline asked, "Pearls Before Breakfast." The article laid it all out. The world-famous musician, the multi-million-dollar violin, the experiment in context and perception. It listed the pieces he had played, the exact duration, the total money earned. It quoted experts talking about beauty and the pace of modern life. All over Washington, in suburban kitchens and office break rooms and on crowded trains, people were reading the article. And a cold, slow wave of recognition washed over hundreds of them. The government worker who had thrown the dollar and run? He was standing by the office coffee machine, the paper in his hands. He read the description of the batch Chacon. He remembered the brief pause, the feeling that the music was kind of heavy. His face went hot with a sudden, stinging shame. That was him? He muttered to no one. He'd had a chance to hear Joshua Bell for free, and he'd paid $1 to get away from it. He felt like a fool. The mother with the 2 kids, now at home during nap time, read the article online. She remembered the beautiful sound, how it had subconsciously soothed her for a few seconds. She remembered tugging her daughter away from staring. A sharp pang of regret hit her. She thought, I could have stopped. For just 1 minute, I could have let them hear something real. It was a missed chance to show her children magic. And she couldn't get it back. The young man in the expensive suit who had shouted on his phone? His assistant placed the newspaper on his desk. He skimmed it, then read it more closely, his frown deepening. He remembered the annoying busker he'd stood next to. A sick, hollow feeling settled in his stomach. He, a man who prized himself on recognizing value and opportunity, had been utterly blind to one of the world's best, right next to him. It was a bruise to his ego he wouldn't soon forget. The maintenance man who had complained about the noise. Someone taped the article to his locker. He stood there, reading it slowly, his lips moving. His squint deepened. He felt a surge of defensive anger, then a confused embarrassment. He'd tried to mop away Joshua Bell. The story would be a joke among his coworkers for weeks. He ripped the article down, crumpled it, and threw it away. For almost everyone who read the story, the emotion was a cocktail of disbelief and profound regret. They had been offered a free ticket to an impossible concert, and they had not only turned it down, they had barely noticed the door was open. They had watched the man in the suit on his phone, or worried about the report, or hurried to the next thing. They had missed the pianist entirely. The article held up a mirror, and they didn't like what they saw. A person too busy, too preoccupied, too locked in their own little world to recognize transcendent beauty when it was right in front of them. The woman who had stopped saw the article. 2. Colleague dropped the section on her desk with a note. "Is this your guy?" She read it, and her hand flew to her mouth. She knew he was a master, but she had no idea he was that master. The name, Joshua Bell, meant nothing to her. She didn't follow classical music, but the magnitude of his fame was clear from the article. Yet for her, the revelation didn't change the experience. It didn't make it better or more important. If anything, it made her even more grateful for her own instinct. She hadn't stopped because he was famous. She had stopped because the music was true. The article just confirmed what her heart already knew. She felt no smugness, only a deeper sense of having been part of a small, quiet miracle that thousands had missed. The story spread far beyond Washington. It was picked up by news wires, discussed on talk shows, debated in blogs. It became a modern parable. People argued about it. Was it a sad statement on society? Or was it simply a lesson about context, that a concert hall is a frame that tells us how to look and listen? But for the individuals who had been there, it wasn't a philosophical debate. It was a personal, private moment of reckoning. They had been tested, without knowing it, on what they valued in a moment of unscripted time. And most of them, to their own surprise and disappointment, had failed. The violinist, back in his normal life, was asked constantly how the experience made him feel. He gave polite, thoughtful answers about context and perception. But privately, he thought most about the $32 and the 3 soft claps from a stranger against a wall. One had measured his market value in that anonymous place. The other had measured his worth as an artist. He knew which one he would carry with him. Time moved on, as it always does. The news cycle churned. The story of the experiment in the metro station had its week in the sun talked about on radio shows, dissected in magazine columns, a topic over water coolers. Then, slowly, it was replaced by the next big thing, the next scandal, the next curiosity. For the wider world, it became an interesting footnote, a piece of trivia. Did you know Joshua Bell once played in a subway, and nobody cared? But for the people who were actually there, the ones whose shoes had clicked past the open violin case, the story never really ended. It settled inside them, changing shape over the years, becoming something personal. The government worker who had tossed the dollar kept the newspaper clipping. He didn't frame it or anything dramatic. He just folded it and put it in the back of his desk drawer under some old manuals. Every once in a while, when he was searching for a paperclip or a spare pen, his fingers would brush against it. He wouldn't take it out and read it again. He didn't need to. That feeling, that hot shame of having rushed away from something priceless, was printed on his memory. It made him a little different. He started, almost without thinking about it, to slow down. He'd pause sometimes on his walk from the train if he heard a saxophonist or a choir group in the station. He wouldn't always throw money, but he'd give them a few seconds of his actual attention, a look in the eye, a real listen. It was a small penance, a quiet promise to himself to not be so blind next time. The mother of the 2 children found her own way to make peace with it. A few years later, when her kids were a bit older, she signed them up for music classes at the local community center. Not because she was trying to make them into prodigies, but because she wanted them to know, in their hands and their ears, how beauty could be built from wood and string and effort. When her daughter struggled with a simple tune on the flute, the mother would sometimes think of the man in the station, his fingers a fluid blur. She'd tell her daughter, "It's not about being perfect right now. It's about hearing the music you're trying to make." The mischance had turned into a lesson she could pass on. The man in the expensive suit, the one who'd shouted into his phone, became oddly quieter in public spaces. He never lost his ambition or his drive, but the bluster, the need to dominate every room with his voice, softened a touch. The memory of his own ignorance, so publicly revealed, had humbled him in a way no business failure ever could. He became a substantial donor to a local program that brought classical music into city schools. He never mentioned the subway story to the people who ran the program. He just wrote the checks. It was his way of paying a debt he felt he owed to the air he had once shouted through. The maintenance man, after the ribbing from his coworkers died down, became the station's unofficial guardian of buskers. He didn't become a music lover overnight, but he developed gruff respect. If a new performer set up, he might wander over, lean on his mop, and grunt, "You got a permit for that?" But then he'd listen for a minute. If they were any good, he'd give a single slow nod. "All right. Just keep it down before 9. It was his version of a blessing. For the woman who had stopped, life continued with its quiet rhythm. She didn't tell the story often. It felt too precious, too much hers, to be turned into casual conversation. But it lived within her like a secret source of light. On difficult days, in moments of boredom or stress, she would close her eyes and go back to that spot against the cold tile. She could hear the melody of the meditation, see the focus on the musician's face. It reminded her that the world was capable of unexpected, unadvertised grace. It made her trust her own instincts more. She started going to free concerts in the park visiting art galleries on her lunch hour. She didn't become an expert. She just became more open. The experience hadn't changed what she did for a living, but it had changed how she lived. And the violinist? He returned to the bright lights and the roaring crowds. He played in the great concert halls, his name in big letters on the marquee. The $32 were framed, a funny story to share in interviews. But the interviewers always wanted to talk about the sadness, the indifference of the crowd. They'd ask, wasn't it depressing? He'd always give a thoughtful answer, but he rarely told them the whole truth. The whole truth was that the experiment had given him a gift far greater than any glowing review. It had stripped him bare. For 43 minutes, he wasn't Joshua Bell, the virtuoso. He was just a source of sound. And in that stripped-down state, he had learned what his music was worth, separate from fame, separate from a ticket price. It was worth exactly one person's complete and total attention. The 3 soft claps from a stranger were the purest review he'd ever received, that it made him play differently. Not better, necessarily, but more honestly. He played for the person in the 3rd row who might be having a terrible week. He played for the kid who had saved up for a ticket. He remembered what it was like to have his music be a sudden, unexpected gift in the middle of an ordinary day. Years later, he was walking through a different city, in a different country, and he heard a musician playing a cello in a narrow, sunlit alley. The sound was rich and sorrowful. The cellist was an old man, his case open with a few coins inside. Without even thinking, the violinist stopped. He leaned against a wall, closed his eyes, and listened. He listened for a full 5 minutes, long after the people he was with had moved ahead. He listened with everything he had. When the piece ended, he stepped forward, caught the old cellist's eye, and placed a generous bill in the case. But before he did that, he brought his hands together and clapped. 3 times. Softly, almost privately. Clap, clap, clap. The old man looked up surprised and gave a gap-toothed smile. No one else had stopped. The ripple of that January morning continued, unseen. There was no grand finale, no moment where all the characters realized the impact. That's not how real life works. Instead, 1,000 small adjustments were made in 1,000 ordinary lives. A little more patience here, a second glance there, a moment of listening offered to a stranger, making music on a street corner. The parable of the experiment was always said to be about missing beauty. But for those who lived it, the real lesson came afterward. It was about what you do after you realize you've missed it. Do you shrug and feel cynical? Or do you resolve to open your eyes a little wider tomorrow? The people in the story, for all their initial hurry, chose in their own ways to open their eyes. They never again watched just the man in the suit on the phone. They learned to listen for the pianist, hidden in plain sight, everywhere.